Alexander Reed had everything a man could buy, and yet, on the night he ordered that pizza, he felt poorer than he ever had in his life. The city glittered beneath his penthouse windows like a field of artificial stars, each light representing ambition, desperation, dreams climbing towards something greater. He owned so much of that skyline that sometimes he forgot what it meant to stand beneath it instead of above it. Success had built invisible walls around him, walls thicker than the reinforced glass that surrounded his 72nd floor sanctuary. Investors respected him. Competitors feared him. Journalists analyzed him. But no one truly knew him. And maybe that was his fault. Or maybe it was the price of becoming untouchable. That evening had been like every other evening. Meetings that blurred together, numbers that soared and fell like heartbeats on a digital monitor, assistants filtering the world so efficiently that nothing unpredictable ever reached him. Predictability had once been comfort. Now it felt like suffocation. When the silence finally swallowed the penthouse after midnight, Alexander realized he hadn't eaten. He hadn't spoken to anyone in hours except through screens. He hadn't felt anything real in days. So he opened the food delivery app, scrolling without thinking, not because he craved pizza, but because he craved interruption. Something simple, something unpolished, something that didn't require strategy. He selected pepperoni. Across the city, Ethan Morales was finishing his shift, unaware that destiny sometimes hides inside routine. His hands were cold from gripping the steering wheel of his aging sedan. The heater worked when it wanted to. The radio cut in and out. But Ethan sang anyway, laughing at himself between lyrics. He believed that if he filled silence with warmth, life would eventually answer back. He was tired. Art school critiques were brutal. Rent was unforgiving, and his mother's medical bills still hovered like storm clouds, but he refused to let exhaustion rewrite his personality. When the address appeared on his phone, he blinked twice. Reed Tower. Even delivery drivers whispered about that building like it was a modern castle. Billionaire territory. People like him entered through service elevators, not front doors. The lobby alone felt like stepping into another world. Marble floors so polished they reflected his worn sneakers, a chandelier that looked like frozen lightning, security guards who scanned him as if calculating his net worth by sight. He swallowed his nose, balanced the pizza box carefully, and took the private elevator upstairs. The ride felt longer than it was. When the doors opened, he found himself facing a single door at the end of a silent hallway. No noise, no neighbors, just quiet luxury. He knocked. For a second, nothing happened. Then the door opened, and there he was. Not the sharp-suited man from magazine covers. Not the ruthless tech magnate from financial news. Just a man in a white shirt, sleeves rolled, collar slightly undone, hair imperfect, eyes tired. Alexander expected awkward politeness. He expected the transaction to end in seconds. But Ethan's presence felt alive. There was something unguarded about him. Something warm. "You're late," Alexander said automatically, the old habit of control slipping out. "Traffic," Ethan replied, unfazed. "The city doesn't care how rich you are." That answer lingered between them like a challenge. For the first time in weeks, Alexander felt something close to amusement. Instead of closing the door, he stepped aside. "Come in." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You don't look like you're about to murder me." A laugh escaped Alexander before he could stop it. A real one. And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. Inside, Ethan noticed everything, not with envy, but with curiosity. The art pieces mounted along the walls, abstract and expensive. The silence that echoed too loudly. The kind of quiet that money buys but comfort doesn't. "Do you ever feel lonely up here?" Ethan asked. The question wasn't strategic. It wasn't manipulative. It was innocent. Alexander should have dismissed it. Instead, he answered honestly, "Yes." The word surprised him. It felt like exhaling after holding his breath for years. They talked longer than either intended. Ethan spoke about painting murals in neighborhoods where buildings were cracked and gray, wanting to give color to people who felt invisible. Alexander found himself listening the way he listened during billion-dollar negotiations, except this time there was no profit to calculate, just feeling. When Ethan finally left, the elevator doors closed softly, and Alexander walked back to the glass wall overlooking the city. He watched a small figure exit the building below and climb into a car that looked like it had survived too many winters. And for reasons he couldn't quantify, he felt lighter, not because he had eaten, but because someone had looked at him without knowing his net worth. Because someone had asked if he was lonely and actually cared about the answer. Ethan's phone buzzed as he drove away, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold. Unknown number. Next time, dinner's on me. AR. He stared at the message at a red light, heart racing in a way that didn't make logical sense. He didn't know that this was a beginning, that the walls around Alexander Reed had just cracked, and that sometimes love doesn't arrive in limousines or at galas. Sometimes it arrives in a cardboard box at midnight. Alexander Reed had spent years mastering the art of control, but control began to slip the moment he invited Ethan back into his world. It wasn't supposed to matter. It wasn't supposed to feel significant. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. A harmless fascination with someone so far removed from boardrooms and balance sheets. Yet as 7 o'clock approached the next evening, he found himself standing in front of his wardrobe longer than necessary, staring at fabrics imported from Italy, tailored to perfection, and wondering which version of himself he wanted Ethan to see. The powerful billionaire, or the man who admitted loneliness to a stranger holding a pizza box. Across the city, Ethan's reality couldn't have been more different. His apartment smelled faintly of acrylic paint and detergent that never fully masked the age of the building. He owned one blazer suitable for occasions that required pretending he belonged somewhere more refined. As he adjusted the color in the mirror, he laughed nervously at his reflection. He wasn't naive. He understood the gap between their worlds. A man like Alexander Reed existed in headlines and skyscrapers. Ethan existed in late rent notices and student critiques. Yet what unsettled him wasn't intimidation, it was anticipation. When the Blacktown car arrived, neighbors peeked through curtains. Ethan stepped inside feeling as though he were crossing an invisible border. The ride to Reed Tower felt quieter than the night before. This time, he wasn't just delivering food. He was entering by invitation. In the penthouse, Alexander stood by the window as the elevator ascended. He watched the numbers climb as if monitoring his own heartbeat. He reminded himself this was irrational. He negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking. Why did one art student disrupt his composure? The answer came uninvited, because Ethan didn't want anything from him. The elevator doors opened softly. Ethan stepped out, dressed simply but with effort. No designer labels. No performance. Just sincerity. Their eyes met again, and the air shifted. Dinner wasn't extravagant. Alexander had dismissed a private chef for the evening, an act so unusual that staff members exchanged confused glances. He had cooked himself, not because he needed to impress Ethan with skill, but because he wanted to offer something uncalculated, something imperfect. Conversation flowed easier this time. Without the buffer of delivery and departure, they stepped into deeper territory. Ethan asked questions others avoided, not about stock prices or expansion plans, but about childhood memories. About fear, about the first time Alexander felt powerless. And Alexander answered. He spoke of growing up in a cramped apartment where eviction notices arrived like clockwork, of studying under streetlights when electricity failed, of promising himself he would never feel that instability again. Wealth had been his shield, success his armor. But armor, he realized as Ethan listened without judgment, was heavy. When Ethan said, "You don't have to be afraid with me," something fragile stirred inside Alexander's chest. No one had offered him safety before. They had offered admiration, desire, opportunity, but not safety. On the balcony, the city roared below, unaware that two vastly different lives are beginning to intertwine. The wind carried the scent of rain and distant traffic. Ethan leaned against the railing, looking not at the skyline but at Alexander. Up close, Alexander noticed details he hadn't before. The faint paint smudge near Ethan's wrist, the calluses from holding brushes and steering wheels, the softness in his expression when he wasn't overthinking. When their hands brushed, it wasn't dramatic. It was hesitant, testing. Alexander's instinct was to pull back, to retreat into caution. But he didn't. Instead, he let his fingers rest lightly against Ethan's skin, grounding himself in warmth that felt startlingly real. He hadn't realized how starved he was for touch that wasn't transactional. The moment expanded, fragile and electric, until the knock shattered it. Reality returned with sharp edges. Assistants, investors, reputation. The machine of his empire didn't pause for personal revelations. Word traveled fast in high society. A billionaire seen dining privately with a delivery driver. Speculation would ignite. As voices echoed faintly beyond the door, Ethan stepped back, uncertainty replacing warmth. He saw it now, the invisible pressure surrounding Alexander, the expectations, the scrutiny. Loving a man like him wouldn't be simple. It would be public, complicated, risky. Alexander's jaw tightened as he moved toward the door, already shifting into a composed executive persona the world expected. But before he opened it, he glanced back at Ethan. For the first time in years, he didn't want to choose power. He wanted to choose connection. And that frightened him more than any hostile takeover ever could. The door handle turned, and the world outside waited. The internet has a way of turning private moments into public spectacle before the people inside those moments even realize what has happened. By sunrise, the image of Alexander and Ethan standing close together on a balcony 72 floors above Manhattan had already circled the globe. It was grainy, slightly blurred, but intimate enough to spark imagination. And imagination, when fueled by wealth and mystery, becomes wildfire. Alexander saw the headline while seated at the long marble dining table where he had cooked dinner only hours before. The same space that had held laughter now held silence heavy enough to bruise. Tech billionaire spotted with mystery man. The article speculated recklessly, dissecting body language as if analyzing a merger. Comment sections bloomed with cruelty. Strangers who had never spoken to Ethan Morales confidently assigned him motives: opportunist, gold digger, social climber. Alexander felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Anger, yes, but beneath that, protectiveness. Across the city, Ethan's morning shattered differently. His phone vibrated nonstop against his nightstand until the noise felt like an alarm he couldn't silence. When he finally looked at the screen, confusion turned to disbelief. Messages from classmates, from distant acquaintances, from numbers he didn't recognize. His roommate burst into the room, phone already open to the article. "Tell me this isn't you." But it was. There he was, identifiable despite the blur. His posture, his jacket, his face tilted slightly toward Alexander's. The comments hurt more than he expected. Not because strangers misunderstood him, but because they reduced him. They didn't know about art school debt or his mother's hospital visits or the nights he skipped meals to afford paint supplies. They saw proximity to wealth and assumed intention. Ethan's first instinct was to call Alexander. His second instinct was not to. Before he could decide, Alexander's name flashed across his screen. Ethan let it ring. Then again, and again. By the time Alexander's car pulled up outside Ethan's apartment building, reporters had already gathered. Word traveled fast in elite circles and faster online. Microphones extended like weapons. Cameras clicked relentlessly. Ethan stepped outside, heart pounding, fury barely contained. "You said you didn't tell anyone." "I didn't," Alexander replied, voice steady but eyes stormed with frustration. One of the investors arrived unexpectedly. Someone took a photo. "And now my life is a headline." Alexander looked at the cracked pavement beneath his polished shoes and realized, perhaps for the first time, how violently his world collided with Ethan's. For Alexander, scrutiny was background noise. For Ethan, it was invasion. "This is my world," Alexander admitted quietly, "and I didn't ask to live in it." The words struck deeper than accusation. They revealed fear, not of wealth, but of erasure. Ethan didn't want to become an accessory to someone else's empire. He didn't want his identity rewritten by gossip blogs. He wanted to paint, to exist, to matter beyond speculation. "What am I to you?" Ethan asked. It wasn't a demand. It was vulnerability wrapped in anger. Alexander inhaled slowly. 4 years. Every relationship he'd entered carried calculation, how it would be perceived, how it might influence stock, how it could be leveraged. But Ethan disrupted that pattern entirely. "You're the first thing in years that hasn't felt strategic." The honesty landed between them, fragile and exposed. Cameras flashed brighter as reporters shouted invasive questions. Investors began sending texts demanding statements. Advisors recommended silence, denial, redirection. Alexander did something unprecedented. He reached for Ethan's hand. Not impulsively, intentionally. Gasps rippled through the crowd as a billionaire who guarded his image with ruthless precision stood openly beside a pizza delivery driver and did not let go. He turned slightly toward the cameras, not to perform, but to refuse shame. "If this is happening," he murmured to Ethan, "it happens honestly." Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. This wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't private curiosity. It was public alignment. For the first time, Alexander chose vulnerability over optics. But vulnerability in a world built on power carries consequences. By the time Alexander returned to his office that afternoon, emergency meeting requests flooded his schedule. His largest investor, a man who valued stability above sentiment, had sent a subject line that felt less like concern and more like warning: damage control. Alexander understood the implication clearly. Markets respond to perception, and perception, once altered, can cost billions. Yet as he stared at the skyline from his office window, he found himself asking a question that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. What is the value of love compared to the value of stock? Downstairs, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, phone finally silenced, heart still racing. He replayed the moment Alexander took his hand. It hadn't felt performative. It hadn't felt defensive. It felt protective and terrifying, because love between unequal worlds is never simple. It demands courage from both sides, and courage, once displayed publicly, cannot be undone. As afternoon light shifted across Manhattan, two men stood on opposite sides of the same city, realizing that what began as a midnight pizza delivery had evolved into something neither of them could control. And the world was watching. Power does not yield quietly. It tightens its grip the moment it senses resistance. By late afternoon, Alexander Reed sat at the head of a conference table long enough to resemble a runway, surrounded by men and women whose loyalty extended only as far as profit margins. They were not villains. They were strategists. To them, sentiment was volatility, and volatility threatened structure. Victor Langford spoke with measured authority, his silver hair immaculate, his tone almost paternal. He had invested in Alexander when the company was young and fragile. He had helped transform vision into empire. And now he watched the empire tremble, not from economic downturn or technological disruption, but from something far less predictable: emotion. "Your image," Victor began, fingers steepled, "has always been synonymous with control." Alexander's expression remained neutral, and it still is. "Control implies foresight," Victor replied. "This situation appears impulsive." Charts illuminated the wall behind them. Stock dipped slightly after the headline. Social media sentiment oscillated between support and skepticism. Investors hated unpredictability. "He is not a threat," Alexander said evenly. "No," Victor agreed. "He is a variable." The word lingered. A variable could destabilize projections, influence consumer confidence, invite scrutiny from competitors eager for weakness. "Distance yourself," another board member advised. "Clarify the narrative. Restore stability." In simpler terms, end it. Alexander listened, but his thoughts drifted to Ethan standing outside his apartment building hours earlier, eyes wounded yet unafraid. He thought about the balcony, about honesty, about choosing not to hide. Victor leaned closer. "You built this company on discipline. Do not let personal attachment erode it." Attachment. They reduced it to terminology that felt clinical and dismissive. Meanwhile, Ethan's world was unraveling differently. At the pizzeria, co-workers avoided eye contact. Customers whispered. His manager, once casually impatient, now appeared nervous. "We can't have reporters hanging around," the manager muttered. "Corporate thinks it's bad for business." Bad for business. Ethan swallowed the humiliation. He had done nothing except share dinner. Yet the consequences landed squarely on his shoulders. By the end of the shift, he was handed a polite but firm termination notice. Just like that, stability vanished. He stepped outside into the cool air, jobless, angry, conflicted, not at Alexander, but at the collision of their realities. Back in the glass tower, Victor made one final statement before adjourning the meeting. "If this continues, we will reevaluate funding positions." Funding. The lifeblood of expansion. It wasn't an ultimatum spoken loudly. It didn't need to be. Alexander understood. When he returned to the penthouse, the silence felt heavier than before. The city lights that once symbolized dominance now resembled watchful eyes. He poured himself a drink but didn't taste it. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Ethan stood at the door, not smiling this time. "I lost my job." The words cut sharper than any investor's warning. "I'm sorry," Alexander said immediately. "I don't want to be the reason your empire collapses." "You aren't. You could lose everything." Alexander stepped forward, closing the space between them. "I've lost everything before," he said quietly, recalling childhood instability, hunger, fear. Money was never security. It was armor. Ethan's voice trembled slightly. "And I don't want to be the crack in it." Alexander reached for his hand again, not for spectacle this time, but grounding. "You wouldn't be the crack," he murmured. "You would be the reason I take it off." The vulnerability in that confession was raw, unpolished. Ethan searched his face for calculation and found none. "I don't want to be your rebellion," Ethan whispered. "I don't want this to be about proving something to the world." "It isn't," Alexander replied firmly. "It's about choosing something real." Choice. That word echoed through both of them. Choosing love in obscurity is simple. Choosing it when it threatens power requires courage bordering on recklessness. "Then prove it," Ethan said finally, not angrily, not manipulatively, just honestly. The next morning, before advisors could dissuade him, before investors could draft statements on his behalf, Alexander Reed scheduled a press conference. News outlets buzzed with speculation. Damage control, they assumed. Clarification. Reassurance to shareholders. But Alexander stood at the podium not as a CEO calculating optics, but as a man prepared to redefine them. Because for the first time in his meticulously constructed life, he was about to prioritize something that couldn't be measured in revenue. And when power meets love, one of them must bend. The question was no longer whether Alexander would protect his empire. The question was whether he was willing to risk it. The room was built for control. Every press conference Alexander Reed had ever held unfolded with precision, statements rehearsed, responses calibrated, narratives managed. Today was different. There were no cue cards, no carefully constructed evasions. Only a man standing at a podium, aware that whatever he said next could either preserve his empire or fracture it permanently. Reporters filled the whole wall to wall, cameras poised like instruments of judgment. They expected a familiar performance, reassurance, distance, polite dismissal of rumors. They expected the billionaire to prioritize stability. Alexander adjusted the microphone slightly, not because he was nervous, but because he needed the brief physical action to steady the weight of the moment. "My personal life has recently become a topic of public discussion," he began, voice even. Pens paused. Cameras zoomed. "I understand the interest. I understand the speculation." A calculated executive would pivot here, redirect attention to quarterly earnings, dismiss questions as irrelevant. Instead, Alexander did something unprecedented. "I will not deny what you've seen." The air shifted. "The man in those photos," he continued, meeting the lens directly, "is someone I care about deeply." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and I will not apologize for that. It wasn't defiance shouted in anger. It was clarity spoken without shame. Across the city, Ethan sat on the edge of his couch, television volume slightly too loud, heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He had prepared himself for retreat, for distance disguised as protection. He had told himself he would understand if Alexander chose caution. But this was something else. Alexander did not frame the relationship as a distraction. He did not soften it into ambiguity. He acknowledged it with the same authority he used to announce acquisitions. The market reacted instantly. Numbers dipped in initial shock, investors testing stability. But something unexpected followed. Public sentiment surged with support. Younger demographics praised transparency. Advocacy groups applauded visibility. Articles shifted tone from scandal to significance. Authenticity, it seemed, carried its own value. Inside the press hall, questions erupted chaotically. Are you concerned about shareholder backlash? Does this relationship compromise your leadership? Alexander answered calmly. My leadership is defined by integrity, and integrity includes honesty. It was a subtle message, not confrontational, but unyielding. When the conference concluded, He stepped away from the podium knowing he had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. Back at his apartment, Ethan exhaled slowly as the broadcast ended. Tears blurred the edges of the screen, not from spectacle but from recognition. No one had ever chosen him publicly before. No one had risked anything substantial in his name. He realized then that this was no longer fragile curiosity. It was commitment. Hours later, when Alexander entered the penthouse, the weight of the day visible in his posture, Ethan was waiting. Silence lingered between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. "You didn't have to do that," Ethan said finally. Alexander removed his jacket, setting it aside as if shedding the remnants of expectation. "Yes," he replied quietly. "I did." There was no hesitation in his voice. Ethan searched his expression for doubt, for regret. He found exhaustion, but not second thoughts. "You could lose investors." "I could," Alexander acknowledged, "but I would lose myself if I pretended you didn't matter." The simplicity of that truth settled into the room like warmth. Ethan stepped closer, uncertainty still flickering in his chest. Love declared publicly is powerful, but it is also vulnerable. "I'm still scared," he admitted. "So am I," Alexander answered. Fear did not diminish them. It humanized them. For the first time since this began, the space between them felt free of interruption. No cameras, no board members, no headlines. Just breath, just presence. Ethan closed the distance. The kiss was not cinematic in the exaggerated sense. It was not fueled by adrenaline or rebellion. It was slow, deliberate, steady. It carried relief, gratitude, intention. In that moment, Alexander understood something profound. Power could command loyalty, but only vulnerability could create connection. And connection was infinitely rarer. But as night deepened and the city resumed its indifferent rhythm, forces moved quietly elsewhere. In a dimly lit office, Victor Langford ended a phone call with a single, measured sentence. "If he won't protect the company," he said, voice devoid of anger but full of resolve, "we will." Love had been declared. Now it would be tested. War rarely announces itself with explosions. In the world Alexander Reed inhabited, conflict moved silently, through contracts, through influence, through signatures that shifted control without raising voices. 3 days after his public declaration, the world appeared calm. Headlines softened. Market analysts speculated but found no immediate collapse. On the surface, stability returned. But Alexander had not built his empire by trusting surface appearances. He recognized the stillness for what it was, calculation. Victor Langford did not retaliate emotionally. He retaliated methodically. Private dinners were scheduled with board members. Conversations framed around fiduciary responsibility quietly questioned whether personal entanglements could cloud executive judgment. No accusations, only implications. Instability. It was a dangerous word in corporate governance. While Alexander monitored shifting allegiances through subtle data points, Ethan felt the consequences more viscerally. An email from his university arrived with neutral language masking sharp intent. Scholarship funding under review due to external attention affecting institutional reputation. A gallery curator who once praised his work suddenly postponed an exhibition indefinitely. Doors did not slam in Ethan's face. They closed softly. Strategically, he understood the message clearly. Pressure travels through the path of least resistance. If investors could not directly challenge Alexander's authority without risking public backlash, they could make the relationship inconvenient. When Ethan confronted Alexander, his frustration was not accusation but exhaustion. "They are coming after me." Alexander's jaw tightened as the pattern crystallized fully in his mind. Victor was applying leverage. "You said you could handle your world," Ethan continued, voice steady but wounded. "Then why does it feel like I'm the one paying for it?" That question pierced deeper than investor threats. Because it was true. Love, declared bravely, had unintended casualties. That night, Alexander drove alone for the first time in years. No driver insulating him from traffic. No tinted windows separating him from the ordinary rhythm of the city. He needed clarity unfiltered by assistance. He replayed Victor's likely strategy. Undermine perception of stability. Create enough board discomfort to justify a leadership review. Position himself as a steady alternative. And suddenly, Alexander recognized the full scope of the maneuver. This wasn't just about optics. It was about control. If a confidence vote succeeded, he could be removed as CEO, and Ethan's presence would be cited as evidence. Alexander did not feel fear. He felt resolve. He returned to his office before sunrise and initiated quiet countermeasures. Share buybacks executed through intermediaries. Calls placed to early investors whose loyalty extended beyond quarterly performance. Data compiled demonstrating record growth under his leadership. If Victor wanted to frame love as weakness, Alexander would reframe strength on his own terms. Meanwhile, Ethan sat alone on the penthouse balcony, staring at the skyline that once felt romantic and now felt hostile. He never desired proximity to power. He desired simplicity, a studio with light, paint under his fingernails, evenings free of scrutiny. When Alexander joined him, he did not offer grand reassurances. He did not promise immediate solutions. "I never wanted your life to shrink because of mine," he said quietly. Ethan's voice softened. "I didn't want your world to feel like a battlefield." Alexander knelt slightly in front of him, not out of submission, but closeness. "It isn't a battlefield," he replied. "It feels like one." There was no denying that. So Alexander adjusted his words. "Then we fight it together." The distinction mattered, not protection. Partnership. Ethan searched his eyes for ego, for pride masquerading as heroism. He found only sincerity. "Not for me," Ethan said carefully. "For us," Alexander answered, and that word rebalanced something fragile. The next morning, the official notice arrived. Emergency board vote scheduled. Leadership confidence review. It was no longer subtle. Victor had made his move, and the empire Alexander built from nothing now stood at a crossroads, not because of market failure, but because its leader had chosen to love without concealment. The coming vote would not simply determine corporate hierarchy. It would determine whether vulnerability had a place in power. And this time, Alexander would not calculate solely for profit. He would calculate for them. The architecture of power is deceptively quiet. No raised voices. No visible fractures. Just polished tables and controlled expressions behind which fortunes are decided. As Alexander Reed entered the boardroom that morning, he understood fully that this was not merely a procedural review. It was an assessment of whether vulnerability had disqualified him from authority. 12 board members sat evenly spaced along the elongated glass table, each representing significant capital, each accustomed to evaluating risk with surgical detachment. At the far end sat Victor Langford, mentor, investor, strategist, composed as ever. There were no greetings beyond polite nods. Victor spoke first, his tone measured, almost regretful. "This is not personal," he began, and in many ways, that was the most dangerous phrase of all. "Our responsibility is to the longevity of this company." He outlined concerns methodically: public perception volatility, media unpredictability, investor anxiety triggered by personal disclosures. He avoided inflammatory language. He did not condemn Alexander's relationship. He framed it as instability, and instability in financial ecosystems invites correction. Alexander listened without interruption. He recognized the elegance of Victor's argument. It appealed to logic rather than prejudice. It positioned removal not as punishment but as precaution. When it was his tone, Alexander stood without notes. He did not defend his heart. He defended his performance. He cited quarterly growth metrics, acquisition success rates, employee retention improvements, tangible indicators of strategic excellence. The numbers, he said calmly, reflect stability. He allowed a brief pause before continuing. Leadership is not the absence of humanity. It is the presence of accountability. His gaze shifted deliberately to Victor. "I am accountable for every decision I make." The statement held laid meaning. Votes were cast electronically, silently. Each board member pressed a button that would either reaffirm authority or dismantle it. The room felt suspended in time as results processed. 7 votes, confidence maintained. 5 votes, removal. A narrow margin. Alexander had won, but it was not decisive enough to eliminate opposition. Victor's face revealed nothing, yet Alexander recognized recalibration behind his stillness. This was not defeat. It was delay. As the boardroom emptied, Victor approached privately. "You survived," he said evenly. For now, Alexander replied. Victor's eyes sharpened subtly. I taught you to protect the Empire. Alexander held his gaze without hostility. And I am protecting it. The exchange was not emotional. It was philosophical. Two men who value control interpreting protection differently. That evening, when Alexander returned to the penthouse, exhaustion replaced adrenaline. The skyline no longer looked like conquest. It looked like responsibility. Ethan stood near the window, tension evident despite his attempt at calm. Did you lose? No, Alexander answered. Relief washed over Ethan's face briefly. But we didn't win, Alexander added. He explained the narrow margin, the fragility of confidence, the certainty that resistance would continue, only less visibly. Ethan absorbed the reality quietly. He had not grown up in corporate arenas, but he understood pressure. He understood persistence. Then we stay ahead, he said simply. Alexander looked at him with renewed clarity. Ethan did not ask him to step down, did not suggest retreat. He stood beside him, not for spectacle, for partnership. You didn't run, Alexander observed softly. Ethan's faint smile held more strength than bravado ever could. Not for you. For us, Alexander completed. The word had evolved. It was no longer romantic optimism. It was strategy. Hours later, just as the city dimmed into early morning silence, a notification appeared across financial news platforms. Anonymous allegations questioning past acquisition ethics. No concrete evidence, just implication. Destabilization. Alexander recognized the pattern instantly. Victor would not attack overtly again so soon. But influence could travel through other channels. Reputation could erode slowly if seeded with doubt. The war had shifted from boardroom to narrative. And narrative, like markets, could be manipulated. Alexander closed his laptop and walked to the window. Below him, millions of lives unfolded unaware of corporate chess matches determining leadership. He realized something profound in that moment. He was no longer fighting solely for position. He was fighting for the right to remain human within power. And that battle would demand more than strategic brilliance. It would demand resilience. Because love had survived the vote. Now it had to survive the aftermath. Pressure does not always arrive in explosive confrontations. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through unanswered messages, through distant friendships, through subtle social shifts that isolate individuals before they fully realize they are standing alone. The media campaign against Alexander Reed did not rely on direct accusations. That would require evidence. Instead, it relied on suggestion. Articles discuss historical business practices, questioning ethics without presenting definitive proof. Online commentators repeated the narrative. In financial ecosystems, perception often precedes reality. Alexander's legal team worked tirelessly to counter misinformation, issuing carefully worded statements emphasizing compliance and transparency. But they understood something fundamental about modern public opinion. Once doubt is introduced, it spreads faster than truth. Meanwhile, Ethan experienced the emotional consequences directly. At university, conversations quieted when he entered rooms. Not hostile, just cautious. People treated him like a phenomenon rather than a person. They spoke politely but distantly, asked surface-level questions, avoided deeper connection. Isolation is psychologically exhausting because it feels polite. No one is cruel. They are simply absent. Ethan spent more time alone in his studio apartment, surrounded by unfinished canvases that reflected his emotional state. Paintbrushes lay scattered across tables like abandoned thoughts. He felt himself becoming a narrative symbol, the working-class artist loved by Billionaire. The story was romanticized online, but real life was far less poetic. One evening, Alexander arrived unannounced. Ethan did not greet him warmly. He was tired, emotionally drained. "You should have told me you were coming," Ethan said softly. "You haven't been answering calls," Alexander replied. The statement carried hurt but not accusation. Ethan inhaled slowly. "I needed space." Space is a dangerous word in relationships built under pressure. It can mean independence, or it can mean emotional withdrawal. "You're shutting me out," Alexander said. "I am protecting myself." Ethan countered immediately. The honesty hung between them like a fragile bridge. Ethan eventually broke the silence. "I don't want to be the reason your company is attacked." The word shocked Alexander more than any boardroom threat, because Ethan was not accusing. He was self-aware. He was carrying guilt that did not belong to him. "You are not the reason," Alexander insisted, "but I am the target they use." That statement was painfully accurate. Ethan's voice shook slightly as he continued. "I didn't choose fame. I didn't choose corporate warfare. I chose you," Alexander said immediately. "But love is not always enough to erase consequences." "Then at what cost?" Ethan asked quietly. Alexander had faced hostile acquisitions, hostile negotiations, hostile markets. But he had never felt this level of emotional uncertainty. Business risk is quantifiable. Heart risk is not. Later that night, Ethan admitted something he had been afraid to voice. "I love you, but I don't want to live in survival mode forever." Those words carried immense emotional weight, because they did not accuse Alexander of wrongdoing. They simply expressed fatigue. Love, when constantly defended, becomes exhausting. Alexander felt something unfamiliar, not fear of losing power, but fear of losing connection. "Do you want to leave?" he asked quietly. The question was not manipulation. It was vulnerability. Ethan did not answer immediately. That silence stretched, filled with every possible future outcome. Staying would mean continuing the battle. Leaving would mean emotional safety but personal heartbreak. Finally, Ethan said, "I don't know if love is supposed to feel like war." Alexander stepped closer. "It isn't." "Then why does it feel like we are always fighting something?" Alexander closed his eyes briefly before speaking honestly. "Because I chose power before I chose love." The confession was not romantic heroism. It was accountability. That night, Ethan did not leave the apartment. But he did not sleep beside Alexander either. He slept on the couch, close enough to stay connected, far enough to think. And in another part of the city, Victor Langford was not celebrating victory. He was preparing escalation. Legal investigations, corporate pressure, structural challenges designed not to destroy Alexander instantly, but to slowly wear him down. Because empires do not fall from sudden strikes. They fall from prolonged pressure. And love, standing in the center of power struggles, must decide how much pressure it can withstand before it changes shape. When power conflicts escalate beyond media narratives, they often migrate into legal frameworks, courts, regulatory agencies, compliance investigations. Systems designed to protect fairness can also be used to prolong conflict indefinitely. The legal summons arrived early in the morning. Alexander Reed had dealt with regulatory oversight before. Every large corporation does. But this was different. The language of the document was carefully constructed, not accusations, questions, requests for historical documentation, compliance verification, financial audit authorization. In corporate warfare, ambiguity is often more dangerous than direct accusation. Direct accusations can be defended against. Ambiguity spreads out. Alexander immediately understood Victor's strategy. This was not about proving wrongdoing. It was about creating procedural exhaustion. That afternoon, Victor visited Alexander personally. There was no hostility in his tone, only calculation. "You chose emotion over structure." Alexander replied calmly, "I chose humanity." Victor smiled faintly. "Humanity does not manage global corporations." Then Victor delivered the real strategic message. If legal proceedings continue for years, investor confidence would decline. Expansion would slow. Shareholders would pressure leadership changes. Slow dismantling is often more effective than direct confrontation. Then Victor made the psychological attack explicit. "Tell Ethan to leave." The request was not about ethics. It was about leverage, because relationships are often used as pressure points in power conflicts. That evening, Alexander went to Ethan and presented everything transparently. No secrecy, no emotional manipulation, just truth. Ethan read through the documents quietly. His expression remained controlled, but Alexander could see emotional fatigue building behind his eyes. "What do you want me to do?" Ethan asked. It was not anger. It was resignation mixed with love. "I don't want you to suffer because of me," Alexander said. Ethan responded with painful clarity. "You're asking me to choose between love and personal peace." "I'm asking you to choose yourself," Alexander said, because he understood something deeper than romantic sacrifice. Love should not become imprisonment. Then Ethan finally lost composure. I am tired of being a weapon in your war. The statement was not betrayal. It was emotional survival. I didn't fall in love with the battlefield. Alexander stepped closer instinctively, but he stopped himself from touching Ethan. He was learning that sometimes protection means restraint. I can step down, Alexander said quietly. The statement was not dramatic heroism. It was real sacrifice. Ethan shook his head. Do not destroy your life for me. Alexander responded with devastating honesty. I would sacrifice everything before I lose you. That sentence carried both devotion and danger, because unconditional sacrifice can sometimes become emotional dependency. Ethan realized something important. If they continued like this, one of them would eventually break. So that night, he left the apartment temporarily, not as rejection, not as punishment, but as self-preservation. Space became necessary for clarity. Meanwhile, Victor moved forward with public regulatory review requests. This escalated the conflict beyond corporate competition. Now it involved legal authorities, public scrutiny, and long-term financial pressure. And Ethan began to understand that loving Alexander was not simply emotional risk. It was systemic risk. Love between power and ordinary life is rarely simple, because power never fights fair. It fights slowly, patiently, until someone collapses from exhaustion. The final battle was never about winning control of markets or maintaining corporate authority. The final battle was about defining what kind of life was worth living. Alexander Reed sat alone in his penthouse office, surrounded by documents that once represented power. Legal strategies, financial projections, defense arguments. He had spent his entire life building structures that guaranteed stability. But stability had slowly transformed into confinement. He realized something profound in the silence. He could defeat Victor Langford. He could preserve his empire. But he could not force Ethan to stay. And love, if it is real, cannot be maintained through pressure. When Ethan returned that night, he looked different, not weaker, not broken, but resolved. I don't want you to choose between me and your company, Ethan said immediately. He did not want heroism built on sacrifice alone. Then he spoke the words that changed everything. I am leaving the city. Alexander felt the emotional impact immediately. Not anger, not panic, just deep, quiet grief. Because he understood. Ethan was not running away. He was choosing freedom. Ethan continued, voice steady. I am not your weakness. You are not my prison. I love you, but I cannot live inside constant war. Love cannot thrive inside survival mode indefinitely. Alexander felt tears forming but did not stop them. He made his own decision then. He called Victor Langford. I will step down as CEO. The silence on the other end of the phone was long. Finally, Victor spoke. You are not losing. You are choosing. And that was true. Power had been his identity for years. But love had given him something power never could, emotional truth. At the airport farewell, rain fell softly against glass windows. People moved around them in blurred motion, unaware of the emotional weight of the moment. I didn't fall in love with your money, Ethan said. I fell in love with your honesty. That statement meant more to Alexander than any market valuation ever could. He kissed Ethan's forehead slowly, not possessively, not desperately, just sincerely. I will find you again, he promised. Ethan smiled with quiet sadness. If it's meant to be, we will find each other again. 6 months later, life had changed for both of them. Alexander no longer ran a global empire. Instead, he built a smaller investment foundation supporting independent artists, young entrepreneurs, and social initiatives. One day, a package arrived. Inside was a painting from Ethan. No return address. Only a message. Still thinking about you. Alexander smiled, because love did not die. It evolved. Standing on a quiet rooftop at sunset, Alexander realized something deeper than wealth, power, or romance. True love is not ownership. True love is freedom shared between two people who choose each other repeatedly, even when the world is not watching. And somewhere in another city, Ethan painted beneath natural light, carrying with him the memory of a billionaire who had loved him not as an accessory, but as a partner. And that was enough.